I drove for a rideshare app for almost 3 years, mostly nights and weekends on top of a regular day job, because the extra money was good, and I genuinely didn't mind the driving itself. In 3 years, you pick up a lot of strange fares. Drunk college kids, people fighting with their partners in the back seat, the occasional passenger who falls asleep, and you have to gently wake them up outside their building. None of that ever bothered me. What I'm about to describe is the only ride in 3 years that made me deactivate my account the same night and never turn it back on. It was a Thursday, close to midnight, quiet on the app that night, fewer requests coming through than usual, which I remember because I was debating just calling it early and heading home. Then a ride request came through for a pickup at a gas station on the edge of town, one of those older stations that mostly serves as a last stop before a long stretch of dark highway heading out toward the rural areas. I accepted it, figuring it was probably someone whose car had broken down or run out of gas. When I pulled in, there was a man standing near the edge of the lot, away from the pumps, not near any visible car, which struck me as slightly odd but not alarming enough to think twice about. He got in the back seat, said a quiet hello, and gave me an address to confirm the destination, which matched what was already loaded into the app. Nothing about him seemed unusual at first. Mid-30s maybe, plain clothes, calm and quiet. The kind of passenger who doesn't want small talk, which honestly most drivers prefer. About 10 minutes into the drive, heading out along that same dark highway stretch, he asked me, out of nowhere, if I ever picked up passengers who weren't really there. I laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of joke, or maybe he was testing whether I'd heard some local urban legend, and said something like, "Not that I know of, why?" And he didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he said, very evenly, that he used to drive this exact route himself, years ago, for a different service, before the app I currently drove for had existed, and that something had happened to him on this stretch of road that he'd never been able to fully explain since. I asked what happened, mostly just making conversation at that point, not expecting anything more than a mildly interesting story to pass the drive. He told me he'd picked up a fare from that same gas station, years back. A woman who'd given him an address that, when he actually arrived, turned out to be an empty lot, no house, nothing, despite the address clearly existing in whatever mapping system he'd used at the time. He said when he turned around to tell her the address didn't seem to lead anywhere. The back seat was empty. No door had opened. He'd have heard it, would have seen it in his mirror, and yet she was simply gone, mid-drive, on a straight stretch of road with no reason for anyone to have exited unnoticed. I remember getting a strange feeling at that point, not fully afraid yet, more just unsettled by how flatly he was telling me this, like it wasn't a story meant to scare me so much as something he needed to say out loud to someone. I asked him if that was why he'd stopped driving. He said partly, yes, but also because after that night, he started noticing the same thing happening to other drivers on this route. Word getting around informally among people who worked that stretch of highway regularly. Always the same pattern. A passenger picked up from that gas station, an address that didn't check out, and by the time the driver realized something was wrong, the back seat was already empty. At this point, I checked my mirror, somewhat instinctively, just to reassure myself he was still there, and he was, sitting exactly where he'd been the whole ride, watching me in the reflection with an expression I can only describe as patient, almost apologetic, like he understood exactly what he was making me feel and hadn't wanted to but felt he needed to say it anyway. I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady, why he was telling me this now, on this exact ride. He said something that I have turned over in my head more times than almost anything else that's ever happened to me. He said he wasn't sure this was really his story to tell, that he'd started to wonder, over the years, whether he'd actually stopped driving that route at all, or whether he was just still on it, picking up the same kind of driver, over and over, trying to warn them before it happened to them too. I didn't respond to that. I focused entirely on the road, watching the address on my app, counting down the distance, telling myself I just needed to get through the next several minutes, and everything would be fine. As we got close to the actual pickup address he'd confirmed at the start of the ride, I glanced at my GPS and it showed we were approaching an empty stretch of field, no structures visible in my headlights at all, exactly matching the story he'd just told me. I slowed the car, my hands shaking on the wheel, and told him, as calmly as I could manage, that I didn't think this was actually his address, that there was nothing here. There was no response. I checked my mirror. The back seat was empty. I hadn't heard a door open. I hadn't felt any shift in the car's weight the way you do when someone exits. I pulled over immediately, got out, checked both back doors, both still locked exactly as they'd been the entire ride. No sign he had ever physically left the vehicle at all. I sat in my car on the shoulder of that highway for close to 20 minutes before I could make myself drive again. And when I finally checked the app to close out the ride, it showed the trip as completed normally, dropped off at the confirmed address, payment processed, a route history showing the exact drive I'd just taken, with absolutely no record indicating anything unusual about the fare at all. No notes, no flags, nothing to suggest the app itself had registered anything wrong. I deactivated my driver account that same night, sitting in my car on that same shoulder, unable to make myself drive even the short distance home without doing it first. I never picked up another fare from that gas station, obviously, since I never drove for the app again at all. And I've never been back to that stretch of highway since, not even as a regular driver in my own car, going miles out of my way on trips where it would otherwise have been the fastest route. I don't know if that man was ever a real driver, if any of what he told me actually happened to him the way he described, or if he was something else entirely, using that story as some kind of explanation he offered every time, to every driver, before doing exactly what he'd just described happening to him. I only know that whatever or whoever picks up rides from that gas station, it isn't looking for a destination at all. It's looking for someone new to tell, right before it's their turn to disappear from someone else's backseat. Now moving through next story. I sold furniture on online marketplaces fairly regularly for a few years. Mostly stuff I'd flip after finding it cheap at estate sales. The same general hobby that got me into a lot of strange situations over time, though nothing quite like what I'm about to describe. Most meetups are exactly as boring as you'd hope. Someone shows up, looks at the item, pays, loads it into their car, done in 10 minutes. This one didn't go that way at all. I'd listed an old wardrobe, solid wood, decent condition, nothing special, priced to move quickly since I needed the space in my garage. Within an hour of posting it, I got a message from a buyer, polite, straightforward, asking if it was still available and if they could come by that same evening. I agreed, gave them my address, standard process I'd done probably 100 times before without incident. The buyer arrived right on time. A man who introduced himself simply, looked over the wardrobe carefully, asked a few reasonable questions about its condition, and agreed to the listed price without any haggling, which honestly made him one of the easier transactions I'd had in a while. We loaded it into the back of his truck together, and as we were finishing up, he mentioned, almost in passing, that the wardrobe reminded him of one his grandmother used to own, similar style, similar wood, and that seeing it had actually made him a little emotional, which he apologized for, seeming embarrassed to have brought it up at all. I told him it was no problem, said something generic about how furniture like that tends to have that effect on people, and we finished the transaction normally, him paying in cash, thanking me, and driving off. I didn't think about the interaction again until about a week later, when I got a message from a completely different account, a woman this time, asking a strange question. She wanted to know if I still had contact information for the man who'd bought the wardrobe from me, because she believed it might have belonged to her family originally, sold off years earlier during an estate liquidation she'd only recently learned details about. I didn't have any way to contact him beyond the marketplace messaging itself, which I offered to forward if she wanted, and she thanked me and said she'd try reaching out that way. A few days after that, she messaged me again, this time considerably more shaken, saying the account he'd messaged me from had been deleted entirely. No trace of it anywhere on the platform, despite it having been active enough just over a week earlier to complete a full transaction with me directly. I checked myself, out of curiosity, and she was right. The account was gone completely. No profile, no message history on my end beyond what I'd already seen. Nothing. I told her I was sorry I couldn't help further, and figured that was probably the end of it. An odd but ultimately explainable situation. People delete accounts for all kinds of reasons. About 2 weeks later, though, is when things actually became something I still can't fully explain. I was cleaning out my garage, the same space the wardrobe had originally sat in before I sold it, and found, tucked into a gap between two support beams where it clearly hadn't been visible or accessible during the sale itself, a small folded piece of paper. I want to describe what was written on it as precisely as I can, because I've reread it more times than I can count since. It was a short handwritten note, addressed to no one specifically, describing, in a somewhat rambling, emotional tone, a memory of standing in front of that exact wardrobe as a child, watching a grandmother fold linens into it, and expressing a wish, almost like a prayer, that whoever eventually took the wardrobe would understand how much it had meant to the family and would take care of it the way it deserved. It was signed with a first name only, a woman's name, not matching the man who'd actually bought it from me, and not matching the woman who'd later contacted me asking about him either. I sat in my garage holding that note for a long time, trying to work out any reasonable explanation. My best guess was that the note had somehow been tucked into the wardrobe originally, decades ago, by whoever the wardrobe had actually belonged to, and had fallen out or been left behind during the move, landing in that gap between the beams by pure coincidence during loading. That explanation made logical sense right up until I actually checked the note's paper and ink more closely, and realized it looked far too clean, too crisp, to have plausibly sat hidden in a dusty garage gap for any real length of time, let alone decades. I messaged the woman who'd originally reached out to me, describing what I'd found, and sent her a photo of the note. Her response took almost a full day to come, and when it did, it was short. She told me the name signed on the note matched her grandmother's name exactly, a woman who had passed away several years before any of this happened, well before the wardrobe had ever been listed by whoever I'd originally purchased it from at the estate sale where I'd found it. I asked her, feeling my hands go a little cold as I typed it, whether her grandmother had ever actually owned this specific wardrobe. She said, as far as she understood, based on family stories, yes, this exact piece had belonged to her for decades before being sold off during a downsizing move years before she passed, and that the timeline meant there was no reasonable way her grandmother could have physically written and hidden that note in my garage, in a piece of furniture she no longer owned after her own death. I don't know who the man who bought the wardrobe actually was, why his account vanished completely within a week of the sale, or how that note ended up in my garage after the wardrobe itself had already been gone for weeks. I never heard from that woman again after that final exchange, and I've wondered since whether she simply stopped wanting to talk about it. The way I've noticed, I've mostly stopped wanting to talk about it too, except for now, telling you. I kept the note. I don't know why. I've thought about burning it, throwing it away, mailing it to her without any further explanation, and I haven't done any of those things. It sits in a drawer in my house now, and every so often, cleaning or looking for something else entirely, I come across it again, and I read it through one more time, and I think about a wardrobe that's out there somewhere right now, in someone's home, with a buyer whose account no longer exists, carrying a wish inside it that somehow found its way out before it left and settled instead with me. Now, moving towards our next story, I want to start by saying I've been on plenty of bad dates through apps, the standard stuff everyone warns you about, people who look nothing like their photos, awkward silences, someone checking their phone the entire time. This is not that kind of story, and I've genuinely hesitated to tell it because I still don't have a clean explanation for any of it, and it's the kind of thing that sounds unbelievable even to me, and I lived through it. I matched with someone on a fairly standard dating app, a profile that seemed completely normal, a handful of photos, a short bio mentioning hiking, and a job in marketing. Nothing that raised any flags at all. We messaged for about a week, comfortable, easy conversation, and eventually agreed to meet for coffee at a place close to both of us on a Saturday afternoon, which felt like the safest, most reasonable way to do a first meeting. He showed up looking exactly like his photos, polite, a little nervous in a normal, endearing way, and the date itself went well. We talked for almost 2 hours, longer than either of us had probably planned, and agreed to a second date the following weekend, dinner this time. I remember leaving that first date feeling genuinely optimistic about it, which doesn't happen often enough to not stand out in my memory clearly. The second date, dinner at a small restaurant we'd picked together, is where things started to feel wrong, though I want to be clear that nothing about it was dramatic in the moment. It was small things. He referenced a detail about my week that I was fairly certain I hadn't told him, a specific errand I'd run on a day we hadn't been messaging. When I asked how he knew that, he laughed it off, said I must have mentioned it and forgotten, which felt plausible enough at the time that I let it go. It happened again later in the dinner, a comment about a friend of mine by name, someone I also didn't remember bringing up in any of our conversations. Again, he brushed it off easily, seemed genuinely confused by my confusion, insisted I must have mentioned it, and I didn't want to seem paranoid or accusatory over what could easily have been, me simply not remembering my own conversations accurately, so I let that go too. The date ended normally. A hug goodnight, plans loosely made for a third date, and I drove home turning the evening over in my head, unable to fully shake a low, persistent unease that I couldn't quite justify with anything concrete enough to act on. I want to describe what happened over the following days as clearly as I can, because it's the part that actually frightened me. I got a message from him the next morning, casual, friendly, mentioning that he hoped I'd slept well after getting home safe. I hadn't told him what time I'd gotten home, or anything about my drive. I asked, trying to keep my tone light, how he knew I'd made it home okay, and he responded, again, completely casually, that I must have texted him, which I knew for certain I hadn't, because I'd gone straight to bed without messaging anyone at all. That response was the first moment I actually felt real fear, rather than just vague unease. I didn't respond to that message. Over the following 2 days, he messaged several more times, each one referencing something specific about my day that I hadn't told him, growing gradually more detailed. A comment about a coworker's name I was certain had never come up, a mention of a route I'd taken somewhere that matched exactly what I'd actually driven, despite having shared none of this with him. I blocked him on the app and on my phone number, which he'd gotten at some point during our messaging that I don't fully remember giving him, though by that point I was second-guessing every detail of our interaction. For about a week after blocking him, nothing happened, and I started to relax slightly, telling myself whatever this had been, it was over now that I'd cut off contact. Then I received a message through an entirely different platform, a professional networking site I rarely used, from an account with no profile photo and a name that wasn't his, but the message itself referenced our second date specifically, the restaurant we'd gone to, a detail about what I'd ordered that only someone who'd actually been there would know. The message simply said that he was sorry for scaring me, that he hadn't meant to, and that he just found it easier to know things about people before meeting them, that it made him feel less nervous, and that he hoped I could understand that. I blocked that account too, reported it, and didn't hear anything further through any platform after that. What actually still bothers me, more than anything he said, is something I only pieced together afterward, going back through my own phone's activity logs out of a growing paranoid need to understand how he could have known any of what he knew. I found nothing. No unauthorized access to my accounts, no shared location settings I'd forgotten about, no mutual friends who could have been passing along information, nothing that offered any technical explanation at all for how a person I'd met exactly twice, briefly, in public, could have known details about my private daily life that I hadn't told him and that weren't visible anywhere online. I never went on another date with anyone from any app after that, not out of general dating anxiety, but because I've never been able to shake the specific, unresolved question of how someone gets that kind of information without leaving any trace of having gotten it at all. I don't know if he had some technical method I simply couldn't find, some old-fashioned method of following me that I never noticed, or something else entirely that I don't have a comfortable framework for thinking about at all. I still occasionally get a strange feeling, walking somewhere alone, that I'm being watched in a way I can't confirm or disprove, and I've never fully worked out whether that feeling is a reasonable, lingering caution from a genuinely frightening experience, or something closer to the same feeling he apparently had, needing to know things in advance to feel less afraid, except in my case, with nothing. To actually know, just the persistent sense that someone, somewhere, still might die. Now moving to our next story. I booked a short-term vacation rental for a solo trip a couple years back, a small, standalone cabin listed on a popular rental platform, tucked into a wooded area a few hours from the nearest sizable town, chosen specifically because I wanted somewhere quiet and remote for a week of actually disconnecting from work. The listing had dozens of positive reviews, nothing concerning in any of them, photos that matched the actual property closely when I arrived, standard check-in process using a lockbox code the host had sent ahead of time. The first 2 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, peaceful, no cell signal to speak of, which I'd actually wanted going in. It was on the third night that I noticed the first genuinely strange thing, small enough that I almost didn't think twice about it. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the cabin's single exterior light, motion activated, clicking on outside my bedroom window, illuminating the small clearing in front of the cabin. I looked out and saw nothing. No animal, no person, just empty forest, the light staying on for its standard 60-second cycle before switching off again. I assumed it was a deer or some other animal passing close enough to trigger the sensor, which the listing itself had actually mentioned as a common occurrence given the property's rural location, and went back to sleep without much concern. It happened again the following 2 nights, always around the same time, always nothing visible when I checked, and by the 3rd occurrence, I'd started keeping my phone's flashlight ready beside the bed, some instinct telling me to pay closer attention, even though I couldn't articulate exactly why. The night that changed things, I woke to the light activating as usual, but this time, when I looked out, I saw a figure standing at the very edge of the clearing, right where the tree line began, facing the cabin directly. It wasn't moving, and the distance combined with the limited light made it hard to make out any real detail beyond a general human shape, tall, still, watching. By the time I grabbed my phone to actually get a photo, the light's 60-second cycle ended and everything went dark again, and when I checked with my flashlight moments later, the clearing was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I found the host's contact information in my booking confirmation and sent a message describing what had happened, trying to keep the tone measured rather than panicked, in case there was a simple explanation I wasn't considering. The response took a few hours to come back, and when it did, it was brief, almost oddly so given what I'd described. The host told me the property occasionally had trespassers from a nearby hiking trail that technically wasn't supposed to cross onto the land, apologized for the inconvenience, and offered no further detail beyond that. I wanted to believe that explanation. I genuinely tried to. But something about the way the figure had been standing, so completely still, directly facing the cabin rather than simply passing through on some accidental trail deviation, didn't sit right with that story, and I found myself checking that same spot in the clearing obsessively for the rest of that day, unable to focus on anything else. That night, I decided to stay awake deliberately, sitting in the cabin's main room with all the interior lights off, watching the window that faced the clearing, wanting to actually witness whatever this was rather than being caught off guard by the motion light again. Around 1:30, well before the pattern's usual timing, I heard something at the cabin's front door, not knocking exactly, more a slow, deliberate testing of the handle, the specific sound of someone checking whether it was locked without actually forcing it. I stayed frozen on the couch, watching the door, and the handle tried again a minute later, same slow, patient motion. I didn't call out. I didn't move toward the door. I simply sat there, watching, until eventually the handle stopped moving entirely, and a few minutes after that, I heard footsteps moving away from the porch, slow and unhurried, crunching across the gravel path leading back toward the tree line. I left the cabin the following morning, 3 days before my booking was actually scheduled to end, packing quickly and driving straight to the nearest town, rather than staying even one more night. Before I left the property completely, though, curiosity got the better of me, and I walked the short distance to that tree line where I'd seen the figure standing, wanting to check, mostly for my own peace of mind, whether there was any actual trail there that could explain a hiker legitimately ending up in that spot. There was no trail, just dense forest, no clear path of any kind, nothing that would explain a lost hiker accidentally wandering onto that exact spot at that exact hour, multiple nights in a row, and then approaching the cabin's front door directly to test the handle. I left a detailed review afterward, describing exactly what had happened, and within a day, the listing itself vanished from the platform entirely. No explanation given, the host's profile removed along with it. I reported the situation to the platform's support team directly, since I could no longer access the listing to warn future guests, and received only a generic response thanking me for the feedback, with no further follow-up despite my repeated attempts to get more information about the property or the host afterward. I've searched for that cabin a few times since, using whatever details I could remember about its general location, and have never been able to find any trace of that specific listing or host anywhere online again, as though the entire booking had simply been erased from existence the moment I left that review behind. I don't know who or what was testing that door handle, or why the host's response to my first message felt so immediately dismissive of something I still believe deserved a more serious answer. I've stuck to established hotel chains for every trip since, and I've never been able to fully explain to anyone why a locked door, in any unfamiliar place, still makes me check it 2 or 3 times before I can convince myself to actually go to sleep.